It's just another Meta Monday. Oh, oh, it's a taking turns fun day. Mono White's gonna run day. It's just another Meta Monday. How you doing, folks? Good morning. Happy Monday. Let's dive on into some data to start this morning, huh? We had a bunch of tournaments over the weekend. SCG has ran their qualifiers and 5K, as well as a couple of other tournaments on MTG Melee. We had the World Championships, which while not the largest sample size, I think is something that we're going to take a look at from an overall perspective to kind of talk about what the best players in the world think is currently good going on in this format. So let's start with a matchup matrix, shall we? So we've got the week 4 of this standard format. So it doesn't honestly look a whole lot different than what we saw in previous weeks. If we look back at the week from last week, the one big difference this week versus last week is this Azurius aggro, blue-white aggro was the one rogue deck from the World Championship that other people picked up and had okay results with. And honestly, as you can see from looking at all of the stuff that we have going on here, there aren't that many decks that are putting up strong performances in this format. You've got mono green, mono white, is it dragons, and then just kind of barely making it across that 50% mark is the Azurius aggro deck. So something to note here is that the turns decks are not listed as the most popular, but that's also in large part due to the fact that they are blown out into 3 different categories. So mono green was 26% of the 926 decks registered, but turns, if you add them up here, we've got 13.7, 12.1, and 4.4. So Aldrin's Epiphany focused decks, this is what, 25.8, 29.8, 30.2 between all of them. So even not counting Izzet Dragons, if you lump Izzet Dragons in with the turns decks, because that is a 3 to 4x Aldrin's Epiphany deck, depending on the build, about 35% of the decks registered here at the top were decks that were leveraging a bunch of copies of Aldrin's Epiphany. Now, the key difference here for people that aren't familiar, like what's the difference between Izzet Dragons and Izzet Turns, is the Izzet Turns deck typically is not playing Goldspan Dragon, and it's playing things like Galvanic Iteration to copy Aldrin's Epiphany. The Dimir control decks, where is it? There is a sample here. I don't believe they're usually Epiphany decks. Yeah, the Dimir control are explicitly not Epiphany decks. So there are some non-blue decks in the format that aren't playing Epiphany. So things to note here. The Azurius aggro stats are actually kind of wild. They're very strong against mono green, and then kind of a dumpster against most of these other things. Although it's worth noting, once you get past this column here, these samples are kind of small to the point of being irrelevant. Yeah, the Azurius aggro deck technically has a couple of epiphanies in it, but I wouldn't really put the Azurius aggro deck, like, I think Izzet Dragons and these ones labeled turns, they lean into like the big epiphany sequences a lot of the time. So Soggy Gruul. So Gruul aggro here includes Gruul splashing blue, I believe, because it's not really Teamer. Yeah, like they had labeled this Teamer Treasures on the World's coverage, but I think it's disingenuous to label this deck Teamer. It's Gruul with a couple of counter spells. Like it's got 8 blue duels, and then it's got these 12 cards that make mana of any color. So I think this is appropriate to label Gruul. I think MTG Data labeled this more appropriately than the folks at Worlds did. So, generically, what does this mean with regards to the format? First off, you'll note that mid-range largely doesn't exist in this format. I think the closest thing to a mid-range deck you could classify in all of this is probably Sultai Festival is a little mid-rangey, but even Sultai Festival, like, it's got 8 2-mana ramp spells in it, and it's got Binding of the Old God. So, like, even this isn't like a typical, like, good stuff mid-range deck. Mid-range deck, really. Yeah, I think the person in chat just called out, like, the format reminds them of Historic. I agree. I think the format has gotten to a point that's very similar to that, where, like, the aggressive decks are beating you down because these turns decks just go so big over the top of whatever a mid-range deck could put together that it's just doesn't really have a chance. Now, one thing that I do think is kind of interesting to note here is that I've seen, in addition to what I think is justified complaints about Aldrin's Epiphany from a play patterns perspective and the things that they push out of the format perspective, it's worth noting that decks like Sultai Festival down here, if we look at their matchup matrix, they are another counter to mono green, because people talking about Ren and Chariot are also the other complaint past Epiphany, and there are kind of mid-rangey decks like this, and I think there's others that get pushed out that just don't get represented here, that have a chance against these Ren and 7 decks, but they're just so bad in the current format because the types of things that are good against Ren and 7 tend to be decks that play to the board, and those decks that play to the board often can't get under the control elements into the extra turns combo that these turns decks put up. And in fact, we kind of see why decks like Sultai Festival aren't more popular here, I think, if we look at the matchup matrix. So, good against mono green, small sample against mono white. But if we look at the turn sample, while the Izzet turns matchup is over 50% here, if we group Izzet, Grixis, and Azurius together, which I think is a reasonable thing to do, these are all kind of turn stacks. Overall, the Sultai Festival deck against the turns archetypes went a total of, this is 4 and 12, so 13 and 19 against these decks that are taking turns. So this 56%, I would bet, based on my experience playing decks like this is not representative, and I would bet the 13 and 19 overall is probably closer to the average. I bet you're about a 40, 60 dog or so to the turns deck, so something like what the Festival deck is doing. The Snow deck would be good into mono green. So that's actually not the case. The Snow deck looks like it was largely pushed out of this format this week, but similar to Dimir Control, Black White Snow, if you look back at the Meta Monday from last week on YouTube, Black White Snow actually does not have a good mono green matchup. The mono green deck grinds out those kind of interactive controlling decks. Mono black isn't a deck that plays to the board. It's a card advantage deck that's looking to leverage sweepers, and mono green with chariots and planeswalkers and creature lands is very resilient to people sweeping them. So that actually does not have a good mono green matchup according to the metrics that we've seen. Last thing to comment here on this matrix is the fact that it's not a good time to be a brew, chat. The brews were bad against actual everything except for a small sample here at 87.5%. So Orzhov Angels is kind of a perfect example of the type of deck that is just dog trash into these turns decks. It's a deck that's looking to go bigger than other things by playing to the board, and it doesn't have counter spells, so it can't interact profitably with the turns deck. All right, now, after looking at, so this was all of the events from this past weekend. We had almost 2,200 matches encompassed in this data. Let's take a peekaboo at what Untapped gives us from ladder metrics this week. So this chart, if you haven't seen it before, this top graph is popularity over time, percentage being played. This bottom graph is win rate over time of those decks being played. So if we take a look here, for the last week, we start here is where we left off. We're at 22% mono green being played with a 63% win rate. And it doesn't look like a whole lot has changed here. So mono green continues to be the most played deck on the ladder while simultaneously having the highest win rate, which that is that I feel like that's always a sign of things not being in a good spot. Is like, so like we've this is the point where at since September 29th, so what, we're going into the second week now, mono green has been both the most played deck and the highest win rate the entire time it's been being played. And if you want some at a glance percentages here, a little bit easier to parse mono green and Izzet Dragons, about 40% of the format between the two. It is worth noting that we do have a mislabeling here in this data. This Azurius control is actually the blue-white tempo deck from Worlds when you click through to it. You take a peekaboo in here. I should pass that along to Untapped to let them know that they should change that. What do you think should change to nerf mono green? I am pretty firmly of the opinion that I think mono green would get worse if Aldurin's Epiphany didn't exist. I think you could also look into getting rid of something like Blizzard Brawl, because I think the fact that the mono green deck has the best 1-mana removal spell in the format is kind of offensive. But yeah, I think Lambton kind of nails it on the head there. I think if you ban Aldurin's Epiphany, like, you make mid-range decks playable, and I think there's a number of mid-range decks that have potential in this format that like take mono green and they drag it down a peg or two. Things like that. So what was mono green here? Even here, right? Like, mono green is bad against white aggro, it's bad against Azurius aggro, and it's bad against Sultai Festival. But Azurius aggro has a bad matchups into turns, and Sultai Festival has bad matchups into turns. So even just here, right? Like, not even accounting for the fact that other new mid-range decks could pop up once you ban Epiphany. Here, we can already see, like, the kind of mid-rangey decks that already exist are decent into mono green as expected from a game theory perspective. And I think there's a good chance that other ones could pop up as well. All right. I assume the historic is mostly more of the same, but let's go ahead and take a peekaboo at it here. Jeskai Control continues to be the most popular thing on the ladder. It looks like we did have a small change. Selesnya Company has popped up here as the second most popular thing, and I guess that doesn't really surprise me. We see here something that's interesting to note if we look at the win rate over time here on the bottom, is that the Thalia aggressive decks are actually the most successful decks in the format at the moment. Izzet Delver just down there at the bottom with the Trash Fire 47% win rate, letting us know that Delver of Secrets is not a playable Magic the Gathering card. Yeah, mono white humans seems like, if you're someone that wants to like try hard the ladder, this has been a theme, right? Like, look at the mono white humans win rate. It is just like consistently great through all of this, and there just aren't people playing it, right? Like, you look at the played percentage, and mono white humans is just like never above what, it breaks 5% finally, and then it goes back down. So it's like the deck Nobody is playing. Yeah, but then you have to play Modern Warfare. And yeah, and honestly, Bob, I think that's a factor, right? Like, I think the to average Magic player probably doesn't enjoy playing a deck like Mono White aggro, and the latter is super casual for almost everyone, right? Like, you're just playing decks to have fun. So it doesn't surprise me that even though people have adapted to Jeskai a little bit and its win rate is down to, only 56%, it's still very popular because a lot of Magic players have control issues in their personal lives. So being very controlling and telling their opponents no is the only bit of authority they ever get to experience. So, they feel like big people getting to memory lapse things. All right. I think that's about a wrap for the day. We're gonna go ahead and dive on into jamming some actual games here. If you missed any of this, I'm gonna get it heading up to the YouTube channel now, and it'll be published in a little bit once it's done processing.